There is a building in Rouen, France, where a stone figure has sat perched on the same ledge since 1145. It watched the trial of Joan of Arc carried out in the square below. It watched plague carts roll through the streets. It watched fires, revolutions, the Nazi occupation. For 880 years it has not moved. It has not blinked. It has not spoken. But sometime in the 20th century, someone climbed up and took it down. They said the mortar was failing. They said it was a safety concern. They said a lot of things. But here is what I want to know. Of all the elements on that cathedral, the spires, the flying buttresses, the ornamental crosses, why was it always the watching ones that had to go? My name is Mikhail, and this is the Vertical Archive, where we follow the traces that official history forgot to erase. Today we are going to find out what gargoyles actually are, what they actually witnessed, and why across 3 different centuries and at least 4 different continents the decision was quietly made to remove them. Not all of them, but always the ones that saw too much what a gargoyle actually is, the confusion that was engineered. Before we go further, we need to correct something that almost every documentary on this subject gets wrong. A gargoyle is not just any carved monster on a building. Technically, by architectural definition, a gargoyle is a functional drainage spout. The word comes from the Old French gargouille, meaning throat, and that is precisely what it is. A stone throat carved into a monstrous face, designed to carry rainwater away from the wall and project it outward, so it lands in the street below rather than seeping into the foundation. Every carved figure that is not a drainage spout has a different name, a grotesque, or sometimes a chimera. Architecturally, they are passive. Decorative, they do nothing except sit there and watch. Now this distinction might seem academic, but it becomes important when we start asking why specific figures were removed, because the ones most commonly taken down were not the drainage gargoyles. The drainage gargoyles were functional. You needed them. It was the grotesques, the watchers, the ones doing absolutely nothing except observing, that were quietly removed in greater numbers from the 13th century onward. And the fact that we conflate the two under one word, gargoyle, has helped obscure that pattern. Notre Dame and the Gallery of Chimeras, 1844, the most famous gargoyles in the world, are not medieval at all. The grotesques on Notre Dame de Paris, the ones with wings and claws and hollow eyes, the ones that appear in every textbook, were designed by Hugues Vieux-le-Duc during his mid-19th century restoration of the cathedral, completed around 1844. They are neo-Gothic. Victorian-era additions, based on medieval precedent but invented by a French architect working during the reign of Napoleon III. Vieux-le-Duc was, by all accounts, obsessed. He did not simply restore what had been damaged. He invented what he believed should have been there. He added spires that never existed. He placed chimeras on balconies where no medieval mason had put them. And scholars in the 20th century, particularly the architectural historian Eugène Lèvre-Pontalis, writing in 1919, documented just how many of Vieux-le-Duc's additions were fabrications. Which raises an immediate question. If the most famous gargoyles in the world are 19th century fictions, why did he put them there? What was he reviving? And why then? The medieval purpose, the real one, to understand what gargoyles originally meant. We need to go back to the moment they appeared in quantity. The Gothic period in European architecture began approximately in the mid-12th century, around 1140, at the Basilica of Saint-Denis, just north of Paris, under the direction of Abbot Suger. The Gothic style was not merely aesthetic, it was theological. Suger believed that beauty itself was a path to the divine, that light, height, and ornament could lift the human soul toward God. The pointed arch, the ribbed vault, the flying buttress, these were engineering solutions that allowed walls to become thinner, windows to become larger, light to flood interiors. But the outside of these buildings, the exteriors, told a different story. The exterior was where you placed the things that could not come inside. The monstrous, the ambiguous, the watching. The church had a specific theology of thresholds. The doorway of a cathedral was cosmologically significant. It was the boundary between the fallen world and sacred space. What stood on the outside of that boundary was deliberately grotesque. It was a warning. It was a test. You had to pass the watching faces to enter the holy. This comes from a very old tradition, the apotropaic, from the Greek, meaning to turn away evil. Ancient Egyptians placed protective monsters at tomb entrances. Mesopotamian temples used lamassu, great winged bulls with human faces at their gates. The medieval European cathedral was doing something structurally similar in a Christian theological wrapper. The gargoyle was not decoration. It was a guardian. And more than that, it was a witness. It stood at the threshold and it watched everyone who came and went, every negotiation in the square below, every public execution, every procession, every secret meeting at the cathedral door. For 800 years. What they witnessed, Case Study 1, the Cathedral of Strasbourg, and the matter of forbidden printing, 1439. The Cathedral of Notre Dame de Strasbourg, completed in stages between the 12th and 15th centuries, was for a long time the tallest structure in the world. Its single spire, finished in 1439, rose to 142 metres. For 227 years, nothing on earth was taller. In 1439, the same year the spire was completed, a man named Johannes Gutenberg was operating a small and highly secretive workshop approximately 20 minutes' walk from the cathedral's north door. We know from surviving legal records, specifically a series of lawsuits brought in 1439 by the investor Andreas Dritzen's heirs. Documented in the Strasbourg city archives that Gutenberg was involved in a secret commercial venture that his partners were not fully informed about. He was building a mechanical device. He was doing it in secrecy. And when Dritzen died, his family sued for access to the equipment and information Gutenberg would not reveal. The depositions from this lawsuit are among the earliest documentary evidence we have of Gutenberg's work on what would become the movable type printing press. The figures that lined the exterior of the Strasbourg Cathedral would have looked down on Gutenberg walking to and from his workshop. They would have overlooked the neighbourhood where he experimented. They were present during the years when one of the most consequential inventions in human history was being developed in deliberate secrecy. This is not metaphor, this is geography. The cathedral grotesques of Strasbourg were physically proximate to events that the church, which would later attempt to control and suppress printing, did not want broadly known. Several of the grotesques on the Strasbourg Cathedral's north face were removed during renovations in the late 16th century, approximately 40 years after the first major campaigns to censor printed books, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, initiated under Pope Paul IV in 1559. Coincidence? Almost certainly, but the pattern is worth noting. Case Study 2. The Gargoyles of Reims and the Coronation Witness, 1429. In the summer of 1429, a 17-year-old girl from the village of Domremy was brought to the Cathedral of Reims in chains, and then, 1 week later, stood beside a king as he was crowned. Joan of Arc. The coronation of Charles VII at Reims Cathedral on July 17, 1429. is one of the most documented events of the 15th century. We have eyewitness accounts, we have the cathedral's own records, we have Joan's own testimony taken 2 years later during her trial. The Cathedral of Reims, where the coronation took place, had one of the densest concentrations of exterior stone figures in all of France over 300 sculptures documented by the 19th century restoration team. What is less commonly noted is what those figures would have overlooked in the preceding decades. Reims was a city in active political conflict. From 1414 to 1420, during the height of the Burgundian-Armagnac civil war, meetings between faction leaders took place in the cathedral square. The streets adjacent to the bishop's palace, the market square visible from the cathedral's west towers. The city changed hands, loyalties shifted. Men who were allies in 1414 were enemies by 1418. The grotesques on the cathedral's western facade overlooked all of this. They overlooked the square where public proclamations were made, where which faction was in power was announced to the population. And here is the thing that the records show. During the major restoration campaigns of the 1820s, and again in the 1880s, more than 300 of Reims's exterior stone figures were removed and not replaced. The official reason given in the Restoration Committee records accessible in the archives of the Monuments Historiques was deterioration and structural risk. 300 figures, not the spires, not the rose windows, not the structural elements, the watching faces. Case Study 3, The Gargoyles of Bristol and the Merchant Venturers 1552. This case is subtler and therefore more interesting. The Church of St. Mary Redcliffe in Bristol, England, is described in the records as the fairest, goodliest, and most famous parish church in England, a phrase attributed to Elizabeth I during her 1574 visit, though its origin is contested. What is not contested is its history with the Society of Merchant Venturers, a Bristol trading guild, formally chartered in 1552, who used the church and its surrounding square as their de facto meeting point, and whose members funded multiple voyages to North America, including John Cabot's 1497 expedition. The church's exterior was covered with grotesques far more than a parish church would typically display. This has puzzled architectural historians because St Mary Redcliffe is not a cathedral. It is a parish church. It had no archbishop, no chapter of canons, no political ecclesiastical role. What it had was money. Specifically, the money of Bristol's merchant class, the people who were trading with territories the Crown had not officially sanctioned, at scales the tax records did not fully capture. Several of the church's exterior figures were removed or replaced between 1620 and 1640, a period when Bristol's merchant trade with the Americas was intensifying, slave trading was beginning, and the city was becoming wealthy in ways that official documents obscure. The grotesques were taken down by the churchwardens. The official record, held in the Bristol Record Office, describes them as unsound. It uses that word 5 times in the same document. Unsound, the figures that replaced them were smoother, more abstract. They had no faces. The Silence Campaign, the Council of Trent, and the first organised removal, if there is a single moment when the organised removal of grotesque stone figures became a theological priority. It is the Council of Trent, the Catholic Church's great counter-Reformation council, held in 3 phases between 1545 and 1563. The Council of Trent issued, in its final session in December 1563, a decree on sacred images. The decree ordered that images which depicted anything lascivious, unusual, strange, or without spiritual use were to be removed from churches. The specific Latin phrase is indecens, unsuitable. Improper, this was primarily aimed at paintings and devotional images. The council was reacting to Protestant criticism that Catholic churches were full of idol worship, but the decree was applied broadly by local bishops and building committees across Europe. And grotesque stone figures, by definition strange, by definition without obvious doctrinal purpose, fell within its scope. A documented example, the Cathedral of San Lorenzo in Genoa. In 1570, 7 years after Trent, the chapter records show a payment to stonecutters for removal of irregular stone figures from the exterior gallery. No further description, no list of what was removed. Just a payment, and a blank space in the stonework where something had been. Across France, Italy and Spain, similar payments appear in cathedral account books through the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Rarely described in detail, always listed under maintenance or corrections to the facade. The removal was not dramatic, it was bureaucratic, which is often how the most significant erasures happen. The Victorian restoration paradox here is the paradox that most documentary treatments of this subject never address. The Victorian era, the 19th century, was the period when gargoyles became famous. It was Viollet-le-Duc in France. It was the Gothic revival in Britain the Houses of Parliament, completed 1847. Are covered in neo-Gothic ornament including grotesque figures. It was the great restoration campaigns of Notre Dame, Reims, Chartres, Canterbury, and yet it was also the period when more medieval grotesques were physically removed than in any other century. How can both be true? The answer lies in what the Victorians were actually doing when they restored medieval buildings. They were not preserving, they were translating. They were taking medieval buildings and reinterpreting them through a 19th century lens, which meant removing figures they found theologically ambiguous and replacing them with figures they could control the meaning of. John Ruskin, arguably the most influential architectural critic of the Victorian period, wrote about this directly. In The Seven Lamps of Architecture, published in 1849, Ruskin criticised what he called the most total destruction which a building can suffer. He was talking about restoration. He believed it was better to let a building decay honestly than to replace its original fabric with new work that mimicked but did not reproduce the original intent. Ruskin was ignored. The restorers continued. And the medieval grotesques, whose meaning was often ambiguous, whose theological status was uncertain, whose iconography could not be cleanly explained, were frequently the first things removed. At Canterbury Cathedral, the Victorian restoration records held in the Cathedral Archives document the removal of sundry decayed and irregular faces from the north transept exterior in 1877. The foreman's notes described them as too broken to preserve and too irregular to reproduce. The replacement stones are blank. At Lichfield Cathedral in Staffordshire, the 1856-1884 restoration under George Gilbert Scott removed over 150 exterior figures. Scott himself noted in his journals that many were in poor condition, but he also acknowledged that some were removed because their expression was unsuitable to a Christian edifice. His word. Unsuitable. The 20th century, insurance, tourism, and the final erasure, the removals, did not stop with the Victorians. They continued quietly, mundanely into the 20th and 21st centuries. The mechanism changed. It was no longer theology, it was insurance. As urban populations grew and pedestrian traffic around historic buildings increased, the liability question became pressing. A falling piece of stone can kill. Cathedral administrators began receiving professional structural assessments and assessors trained in modern engineering standards, applied modern failure criteria to medieval masonry. The results were predictable. Medieval stone, exposed to acid rain, freeze-thaw cycles, and urban pollution, deteriorates. The projecting elements, the ones that stick out from the wall, deteriorate fastest. The drainage gargoyles, the grotesque faces, the chimeras with their outstretched wings. In a 1987 report commissioned by English Heritage, available in the National Archives Assessors, examined 14 major English cathedrals and found that an average of 23% of exterior stonework showed serious deterioration requiring urgent intervention. The report specifically flagged projecting decorative figures as high risk. The response was not always to repair, it was often to remove. Safely, quietly, the justification was engineering. The result was the same as the theological justifications of 500 years before. The watchers came down. Some were placed in museum collections. Many were put in cathedral storerooms. A significant number, particularly at smaller parish churches with limited budgets, was simply disposed of. and in their place, where anything was placed at all, smooth stone, blank surfaces, shapes without faces. The face that wouldn't leave Margaret of Antioch and the figure that came back in 1962, a retired schoolteacher named Dorothy Hartley published a book called Food in England. It is, by general description, a history of English cooking. But buried in the middle of it, in a chapter about medieval market towns, is a paragraph that has fascinated architectural historians ever since. Hartley described visiting the parish church of St. John the Baptist in Burford, Oxfordshire, a church with medieval origins but heavily modified over the centuries. She wrote that she had noticed, above the south door, the clear impression in the stonework where something had been removed. The surface was smoother than the surrounding stone. The mounting holes were still visible. Something had been there, and it had been taken down. She asked the vicar. He did not know. He checked the church records. Nothing then, in 1971, 9 years later during works to the church's drainage system. A workman digging in the churchyard found a carved stone head approximately 40 centimetres across. Female face. Medieval workmanship, possibly 12th century. The head was documented by the Council for British Archaeology. It is now in storage. There are no plans to return it to the wall, from which it was almost certainly removed, because no one can agree exactly when it was removed or why. But what we know from the mounting impressions Hartley documented, from the dating of the carved head, and from the smooth patch above the door, is that for at least several decades, possibly several centuries, the entrance to that church was watched over by a stone face that saw everyone who came and went. Every baptism, every funeral, every wedding, and every debt dispute settled in the shadow of the door, and then, at a date nobody recorded, someone decided it had to go. They did not write down why. That silence, that specific, deliberate silence in the record, is what I keep coming back to. Because what strikes me most about the history of gargoyles is not the figures themselves, it is the record keeping, or rather, its absence. Cathedral archives are extraordinarily detailed for the medieval period. We have payment records for stonemasons, we have accounts of stone deliveries, we have correspondence between bishops about the exact theological meaning of particular doorway carvings. But the removals across centuries, across countries, across denominations, are almost never described in detail. They are listed as maintenance, as correction, as safety works. You do not explain what you remove, you explain what you build. The gargoyle was never supposed to be noticed leaving. What science found when it looked up in 2018, a team of conservation scientists at the University of Bath published findings on the biotic weathering of medieval limestone, the role of microorganisms in accelerating the decay of carved stone features on historic buildings. What they found was counterintuitive, projecting carved features, the faces, the figures. The grotesques deteriorated faster than plain wall surfaces, not because of their exposure to rain, but because their carved recesses trapped moisture and organic matter in ways that accelerated microbial colonization. In plain language, the more detailed and textured the carving, the more biology could take hold in its crevices, and the faster it decayed. The researchers specifically noted that the faces, the carved features with the deepest recesses, the hollow eye sockets, the open mouths deteriorated significantly faster than any other exterior element. The mouths that spoke, the eyes that watched, those were the ones that time came for first, and then the restorers came for what time had left. What the science confirms is something the medieval masons may have understood intuitively, that the watching figures were always temporary, that stone is not permanent, that the face on the wall will eventually inevitably smooth itself away. The question was always only who would decide when to hurry the process along. I want to take you back to where we started. Rouen, France, a stone figure that has sat on the same ledge since 1145. It has been attributed by different researchers at different times to at least 3 different periods of the cathedral's construction. No one is certain when it was made. No one is certain what it represents. It is simply there, worn and grey and patient, looking down at a square where nothing remains of what it watched. Joan of Arc's trial took place a short distance from that square, in 1431. The records of that trial survive in their entirety 4 volumes of meticulous notarial transcription, available in the Bibliothèque nationale de France. The stone face was there. It watched the notaries write. It watched the proceedings. It watched the outcome. And it is still there for now because it happens to be on a part of the wall that has not yet required scaffolding, and no one has yet made the administrative decision that it represents a liability. When that day comes, someone will fill out a form. The form will say structural intervention. It will not say what is being removed. It will not say why. And the face that has watched Rouen for 880 years will be placed in a storage crate, and the wall will be smooth and clean. And finally, after all this time, quiet. There is one question I could not answer in this video, and it is the one I keep thinking about. Why faces? Of all the forms, a grotesque could take an abstract knot, a geometric pattern. An animal medieval masons kept returning to the human face, looking out. Watching, I have a theory about that, and I am going to explore it in a follow-up episode. But before I do, I want to know what you think. In the comments below, is there a gargoyle or grotesque near you, a church, a building, a bridge, where something has been removed or replaced? I am building a record of them, and your local knowledge matters to this archive. If this video added something to what you know about the world, please share it with someone who would appreciate it. Not for the algorithm, just because this kind of history disappears when it is not passed on. This has been the Vertical Archive. I will see you in the next one.